A stranger with no memory woke up on a farm, and the woman who saved him had no idea she was holding the future of a billionaire in her hands. The storm had finally passed, leaving the Montana sky painted in shades of silver and pale blue. The wheat fields surrounding Maggie Turner's farm stretched for miles, still glistening from the night's rain. Normally, mornings were her favorite time of day. The quiet helped her forget the bills stacked on the kitchen table and the letter from the bank sitting unopened beside them. But not today. Today felt different. As Maggie stepped off her porch with a cup of coffee warming her hands, she noticed broken fence posts scattered across the eastern field. With a tired sigh, she pulled her jacket tighter and started walking through the wet grass. Every damaged fence meant more money she didn't have. Every repair brought her one step closer to losing the farm her family had owned for nearly 80 years. The wind carried the scent of rain and fresh soil as she crossed the property. Then she stopped. Something lay ahead between rows of flattened wheat. At first, she thought it was debris carried in by the storm. But as she moved closer, her heartbeat quickened. It was a man. He was lying on his side, soaked from the rain, his clothes covered in mud. For one frightening second, Maggie feared the worst. Then she saw his chest rise and fall. Relief washed over her. He was alive. "Hey," she called gently as she knelt beside him. "Can you hear me?" There was no answer. She looked around. No vehicle, no backpack, no sign of where he had come from. The nearest highway was over 15 miles away. Nothing about the situation made sense. Still, she couldn't leave him there. Nearly an hour later, the stranger was resting beneath thick blankets in her farmhouse guest room. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the house, while rainwater dripped from his clothes hanging near the mudroom heater. Maggie checked on him between chores, unsure what would happen when he finally woke up. Around noon, she heard movement. She hurried down the hallway and pushed open the door. The man was sitting up slowly, staring at the unfamiliar room around him. His blue eyes settled on her. Confusion filled them. "Where am I?" he asked. His voice sounded rough, as though he hadn't spoken in days. "You're on my farm," Maggie replied. "Outside Willow Creek." He frowned. "Farm? I found you unconscious in one of my fields." The stranger looked away, trying to process her words. His gaze moved across the room before returning to her face. "Who are you?" "Maggie Turner." Silence followed. Then she asked the obvious question. "What's your name?" The man opened his mouth to answer. Nothing came out. His expression changed. Confusion became concern. Concern became fear. He rubbed a hand across his forehead. "I don't know." Maggie stared at him. "You don't know?" He shook his head slowly. "I can't remember." Outside, the wind rustled through the wheat fields. Inside, the room suddenly felt very small. Neither of them realized it yet, but the storm had brought more than a stranger to Maggie Turner's farm. It had delivered a secret powerful enough to change both of their lives forever. The next morning arrived with clear skies and sunlight spilling across the Montana plains, but Maggie Turner felt no lighter than she had the day before. The letter from the bank still sat on the kitchen counter. 7 days. That was all she had left before generations of family history could disappear with the stroke of a pen. She poured herself a cup of coffee and stared out the window at the wheat fields shimmering in the early morning light. Usually the view brought her comfort. Today it only reminded her of everything she stood to lose. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned to see the stranger standing awkwardly in the doorway. He was wearing one of her late father's old flannel shirts and a pair of jeans she had found in storage. Somehow they fit him surprisingly well. "Good morning," Maggie said. "I hope you slept okay." He nodded. "Better than I probably deserved." She gave him a look. "You really need to stop thanking me for every little thing." For the first time, she noticed a faint smile touch his face. It vanished almost immediately, replaced by uncertainty. He glanced around the kitchen as though searching for answers hidden somewhere between the walls. "Any memories?" Maggie asked. He hesitated. "Not exactly." She handed him a plate of eggs and toast. "Try." The stranger sat down and stared at the food for a moment. "I know how to hold a business conversation." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "That is a strange thing to know." "I know." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I know what private jets look like inside." Maggie nearly choked on her coffee. "Private jets?" "I do not know why." He frowned. "I just know." That answer stayed with her throughout the morning. After breakfast, she headed outside to repair the damaged fencing. To her surprise, The stranger followed. "You should be resting," she said. "I am tired of sitting around." Before she could argue, he picked up a hammer and began helping. What surprised Maggie even more was how quickly he learned. Within an hour, he was working beside her as though he had repaired fences his entire life. Yet every so often something unusual slipped through. He analyzed problems with startling efficiency. He organized tasks instinctively. He spoke with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. None of it matched the image of an ordinary traveler. Around noon, they stopped beneath the shade of an old cottonwood tree. Maggie handed him a bottle of water. "We cannot keep calling you the stranger forever." He laughed softly. "Fair point. Until your memory comes back, you need a name." He considered that. "Do I get to choose?" "Of course." His gaze drifted across the endless fields. After a long silence, he said, "James." Maggie nodded. "James it is." The name felt temporary, like a coat borrowed for a season, but it was something. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Maggie found herself studying him again. James seemed calm on the outside, yet she could sense the frustration underneath. Every passing hour reminded him that he did not know who he was. That evening, after dinner, Maggie returned to the silver locket she had found among his belongings. She opened it once more and traced the engraved words with her thumb. "Come back to where you became human." Across the room, James stared into the fading sunset beyond the window. Neither of them understood it yet, but the answer to his identity was hidden inside that simple message, waiting for the day when the past finally came looking for him. The following week brought long days and cool evenings, and before either of them realized it, James had become woven into the daily life of Turner Farm. Every morning began before sunrise. Maggie would step onto the porch with a mug of coffee, expecting to find herself alone, only to discover James already outside working. Sometimes he was repairing equipment. Other times he was studying irrigation lines or checking feed supplies. The strange thing was not that he worked hard. It was how naturally leadership seemed to come to him. One afternoon, a delivery truck arrived with the wrong order. Before Maggie could even walk over, James had calmly organized the problem, negotiated a solution, and arranged a replacement shipment. The driver left impressed. Maggie stood beside the barn watching him. "You handled that like you have been running businesses your whole life." The moment the words left her mouth, something changed in his expression. James froze. His eyes narrowed as though he were staring at something far away. For a split second, images flashed through his mind. Glass buildings, conference rooms, men and women waiting for him to speak. Then the vision disappeared. He pressed a hand against his temple. "Are you okay?" Maggie asked. James nodded slowly. "I saw something." Her heart jumped. "A memory?" "Maybe." He looked frustrated. "It was gone before I could understand it." That evening they sat on the porch while the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky glowed orange and gold across miles of open land. James held the silver locket in his hand. Over the past few days he had studied the engraved message countless times. "Come back to where you became human." "Do you think it means something?" he asked quietly. Maggie looked at the locket. "Someone wanted you to remember something important. What if I do not like who I was?" The question surprised her. James stared into the distance. "What if there is a reason I cannot remember?" Maggie considered her answer carefully. "From everything I have seen, you are a good man." He laughed softly. "You do not know that. Neither do you." Their eyes met briefly. Something warm passed between them before both looked away. The next day brought another surprise. Maggie was reviewing bills at the kitchen table when James sat down across from her. He quietly studied the paperwork. Within minutes, he began asking questions about operating costs, crop forecasts, and debt schedules. The deeper he looked, the more focused he became. Finally, he took a pencil and started making notes. Maggie watched in disbelief. By the time he finished, he had identified several opportunities to reduce expenses and increase revenue over the next year. The plan was detailed, practical, and surprisingly sophisticated. "James," Maggie said slowly, "normal people do not just sit down and create financial recovery plans like this." He looked at the numbers in front of him. For the first time, confidence replaced confusion. "Then maybe I was never normal." Neither of them noticed the black SUV parked nearly half a mile away on a ridge overlooking the property. It remained there only a few minutes before turning around and disappearing down the highway. Somewhere beyond Montana, people had finally begun to realize that the man they had been searching for was still alive. The envelope sat on the kitchen table long after midnight. Maggie must have read the message a dozen times, yet the words never became any less unsettling. "We know where you are now." There was no signature, no explanation, no clue about who had delivered it. Outside, the farm rested beneath a blanket of stars, but neither Maggie nor James slept much that night. The next morning arrived cold and clear. Maggie found James standing near the barn staring toward the distant highway. "You think whoever sent that note is dangerous?" she asked. James considered the question carefully. "I do not know." He looked frustrated. "That is the problem. Every answer feels like it belongs to someone else." Maggie folded her arms. "Maybe we should call the sheriff." James nodded. "Maybe." Yet neither of them moved. Something about the message felt less like a threat and more like a warning that the quiet life they had built over the past few weeks was running out of time. Later that afternoon, Maggie drove into Willow Creek to meet with the bank manager. The meeting lasted less than 20 minutes. By the time she returned, the disappointment on her face said everything. James was repairing a section of fencing when he saw her truck pull into the driveway. He immediately knew the news was not good. "How bad?" he asked. Maggie forced a smile that fooled neither of them. "The same as before." She climbed out of the truck. 7 days became 5. James stared at her. "That is it." She nodded. "That is it." For several seconds neither spoke. Then James surprised her. "Show me everything." "What?" "Every loan document. Every expense report. Every contract." Maggie shook her head. "James, this is not your problem." "Maybe not." He met her eyes. "But I am here." Something in his voice convinced her. That evening they spread paperwork across the kitchen table. Boxes of receipts, loan agreements, equipment leases, tax records. Maggie expected James to become overwhelmed. Instead, the opposite happened. The more documents he reviewed, the more focused he became. Hours passed. His eyes moved quickly from page to page. He circled numbers, made notes, asked precise questions. It was as though a hidden part of his mind had suddenly awakened. Around 10 o'clock, he pushed back from the table. "Your farm can survive." Maggie stared at him. "You figured that out in one evening?" "No." He pointed at several pages. "The farm was never the problem." She frowned. "What does that mean?" James tapped a contract she had barely glanced at before. "Someone wants this land." A chill ran through her. "What are you talking about?" "These offers to purchase neighboring properties. The timing of the loan pressure. The valuations." He looked up. "This is too coordinated to be a coincidence." Maggie slowly sat down. "You sound very certain." James fell silent. Because the truth was that he did sound certain. In fact, he sounded like someone who had spent years analyzing high-level business deals. Yet he still could not remember his own last name. As the clock approached midnight, Maggie glanced at the silver locket resting beside the paperwork. "Come back to where you became human." For the first time, she began to wonder if whoever James had once been was far more important than either of them had imagined. 5 days. That was all the time remaining before the bank's deadline arrived. Maggie tried not to think about it, but the number followed her everywhere. It lingered in the back of her mind while she fed the horses, repaired equipment, and balanced invoices at the kitchen table late into the night. Yet somehow, despite the pressure hanging over the farm, she found herself smiling more often than she had in months. James noticed it too. One crisp morning, they were loading supplies into the old pickup truck when he looked at her and said, "You smile differently now." Maggie laughed. "That is a strange thing to say." "It is true." He leaned against the truck bed. "The first day I arrived here, it felt like you were carrying the weight of the world." "Maybe I was." "And now?" Maggie looked across the fields glowing beneath the early sunlight. "Now it feels a little lighter." Their eyes met for a moment before she quickly looked away. The truth was becoming difficult to ignore. Somewhere between repairing fences and sharing quiet dinners, a connection had formed between them. It was not dramatic. It was not sudden. It had grown slowly, like something taking root beneath the surface. That afternoon, they drove into town to purchase parts for the irrigation system. As they walked through Willow Creek, James noticed how many people greeted Maggie by name. The cashier at the hardware store asked about her crops. The woman at the bakery handed her an extra pie and refused payment. Even the elderly man sitting outside the barber shop tipped his hat when she passed. "Everybody knows you," James said as they crossed Main Street. Maggie shrugged. "That is what happens when your family has lived somewhere for 80 years. James smiled. No, that is what happens when people care about you. The comment stayed with Maggie for the rest of the day. That evening, after dinner, they sat on the porch watching the sunset spread across the Montana sky. The colors seemed endless, stretching across the horizon in shades of gold, orange, and deep purple. James turned the silver locket over in his hands. He had done that almost every day lately. "Do you ever wonder why you found me?" he asked quietly. Maggie looked at him. "You mean in the field?" He nodded. "What if you had taken a different path that morning?" Maggie smiled softly. "Then somebody else would have found you." "I am not so sure." There was a sincerity in his voice that made her heart ache. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The world seemed to grow very still around them. Then James looked toward the distant highway. A strange expression crossed his face. "What is it?" Maggie asked. He frowned slightly. "Nothing." But it was not nothing. For the briefest moment, another image had flashed through his mind. A television screen. His own face. Bright lights. Reporters. Then it disappeared as quickly as it had come. James stared into the darkness beyond the fields, unaware that somewhere hundreds of miles away, a national news network was preparing a story that would soon change everything. The drive back to the farm felt longer than any road Maggie had ever traveled. Neither of them spoke much. The old pickup truck moved through miles of open Montana countryside, while a convoy of black SUVs followed at a distance. Everything looked the same outside the windows. The wheat fields, the fences, the rolling hills beneath the afternoon sun. Yet somehow nothing felt the same anymore. James was gone. In his place sat Alexander Hale, one of the wealthiest men in the country. At least that was what the television had said. At least that was what the attorney had called him. Alex stared out the passenger window, trying to make sense of memories returning in fragments. Faces, buildings, meetings, headlines, his company, his responsibilities. A life so different from the one he had lived on the farm that it almost felt like someone else's story. When they finally reached the farmhouse, several members of his team were already waiting. Daniel Foster stood near the porch speaking quietly into a phone. A woman carrying a tablet reviewed schedules and travel plans. Everything moved with speed and efficiency. Maggie watched the scene unfold from a distance. This was Alex's world. She could see it now. The confidence, the organization, the people who immediately looked to him for direction. For the first time since finding him in the wheat field, she felt like an outsider. Alex noticed. "Maggie." She turned toward him. "You should probably talk to your people." A shadow crossed his face. "You are not one of my people?" The question caught her off guard. For a moment, neither moved. Then Daniel approached carefully. "Mr. Hale, the board has scheduled an emergency meeting tomorrow morning in Seattle. The media situation is escalating. Investors need answers." Alex nodded automatically. The response came so naturally it startled even him. More memories surfaced. Conference rooms, earnings reports, strategic decisions. The man he had been was slowly returning. Maggie felt it happening. She could see it in the way he carried himself, the way he listened, the way everyone around him immediately responded. That evening they sat on the porch one last time before sunset. The familiar silence felt different now. He held the silver locket in his hand. "I remember some things," he admitted quietly. Maggie looked toward the horizon. "Enough. Not enough." He turned the locket over. "But I remember that none of it felt like this." Maggie smiled sadly. "This is just a farm." Alex shook his head. "No. This is the first place I have felt at peace in a very long time." The words hung between them as the sun disappeared beyond the fields. In the distance, the lights from the waiting SUVs glowed softly in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow, Alex would return to a world of private jets, boardrooms, and billion-dollar decisions. But sitting beside Maggie on that porch, listening to the wind move through the wheat, he found himself wondering whether the life he had remembered was actually the life he wanted. The days that followed were some of the hardest Maggie could remember. Life on the farm continued whether her heart was ready or not. The horses still needed feeding. The fences still needed repairs. The bills still waited on the kitchen table every morning. Yet everything felt emptier now. More than once she caught herself looking toward the driveway, expecting to see an old pickup truck pull in with James behind the wheel. Then reality returned. James had never existed. He had been Alexander Hale all along. Meanwhile, nearly 1,000 miles away, Alex found himself trapped inside a life that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The moment he returned to Seattle, his schedule filled with board meetings, investor calls, interviews, and endless reports. Every day brought another reminder of who he had been before losing his memory. Yet instead of feeling relieved, he felt disconnected. One evening, after a 12-hour meeting, he stood alone in his penthouse overlooking the city skyline. The view was breathtaking. Glass towers stretched toward the clouds. Lights sparkled across the horizon. It was everything people dreamed about. Yet all Alex could think about was a farmhouse kitchen in Montana. The next morning, another piece of his memory returned. He was reviewing documents when he noticed a familiar company name buried inside a report. The corporation attempting to acquire thousands of acres of farmland across Montana, including land surrounding Turner Farm. A strange feeling settled over him. He requested additional files. What he discovered raised even more questions. The acquisition campaign had accelerated during the weeks he was missing. Several executives had approved unusual transactions without his knowledge. Even stranger, many of those approvals led back to a single individual, Richard Vance, the company's chief operating officer. Alex stared at the reports late into the night. Fragments of memory began connecting. He remembered arguments, disagreements, concerns about aggressive expansion strategies. He remembered warning people that some deals felt unethical. Then another memory surfaced. A conversation shortly before his disappearance. Richard insisting on pushing forward. Alex refusing. The realization left him unsettled. Back in Montana, Maggie received devastating news. The bank officially rejected her final request for an extension. She now had less than 48 hours before foreclosure proceedings would begin. That evening, she sat alone on the porch watching the sunset fade across the wheat fields. For the first time in months, she felt completely defeated. Her father's farm, her family's legacy, everything seemed to be slipping away. Hundreds of miles away, Alex sat in a boardroom reviewing one final report when something caught his attention. Turner Farm appeared on a list of properties targeted for acquisition by a subsidiary connected to Richard's expansion project. Alex's stomach tightened. Suddenly, the pressure on Maggie's farm no longer looked like bad luck. It looked deliberate. The pieces were beginning to form a picture he did not like. As he stared at the documents spread across the conference table, his eyes drifted toward the silver locket resting beside him. Come back to where you became human. For the first time since recovering his identity, Alex understood what the message might mean. The farm had not simply saved his life. It had shown him the kind of man he wanted to become. And if someone was trying to take that away from Maggie, he knew exactly where he needed to go next. The following morning began with a sense of purpose neither Alex nor Maggie had felt in weeks. Instead of waiting for events to happen to them, they finally had a chance to fight back. Before sunrise, Alex was already on the phone with attorneys, auditors, and members of his board. One by one, the facts continued to fall into place. Hidden inside hundreds of pages of financial records was a pattern too clear to ignore. Richard Vance had quietly created a network of companies that purchased farmland through pressure, timing, and carefully structured deals. Many struggling families never realized they were negotiating with organizations connected to the same source. Turner Farm had been one target among many. By midday, Alex and Maggie traveled to Helena to meet with regulators and legal investigators. Maggie felt out of place walking through government offices and conference rooms filled with professionals in expensive suits. Yet every time uncertainty appeared, Alex reassured her. You belong here, he told her. This started with your farm. Your voice matters. For the first time since her financial troubles began, Maggie felt someone was truly listening. Hours later, investigators confirmed what Alex suspected. Several acquisition approvals contained irregularities. Internal communications revealed that important information had been hidden from shareholders. While nothing pointed to criminal activity, the evidence clearly showed deliberate attempts to push expansion projects forward without proper oversight. Richard's position inside the company suddenly became much more fragile. That evening, Alex attended an emergency board meeting. The atmosphere was tense. Executives filled the room, while screens displayed reports gathered over the previous 48 hours. Richard appeared calm at first. He dismissed concerns as misunderstandings and blamed lower-level managers for questionable decisions. But the confidence slowly faded as new documents appeared. Email chains, authorization records, financial projections. Every explanation became harder to defend. By the end of the meeting, The board voted unanimously to suspend the acquisition program pending a full review. Richard left the room without saying much, but the influence he had spent years building was already slipping away. Meanwhile, Maggie returned to the farm exhausted but hopeful. For the first time in months, she believed the property might survive. As the sun set across the wheat fields, she sat alone on the porch holding the silver locket. The engraved message seemed different now. Come back to where you became human. She finally understood why Alex carried it everywhere. Wealth could build companies. Success could earn admiration. But neither guaranteed happiness. Somehow, in losing his memory, Alex had rediscovered the parts of himself that mattered most. Late that night, headlights appeared in the driveway. Maggie stepped outside and found Alex standing beside his truck. He looked tired, but there was relief in his eyes. "It is over," he said quietly. "The board has everything they need." Maggie smiled for what felt like the first genuine time in weeks. They stood together beneath a sky filled with stars, surrounded by fields stretching toward the horizon. The crisis was not completely finished, but the worst of it was finally behind them. And for the first time since a storm had delivered a stranger to her farm, both of them could begin imagining a future that belonged to them instead of their past. 1 year later, spring arrived early across Montana. Fresh green fields stretched toward the horizon, and Turner Farm stood stronger than it had in decades. The old barns had been restored. New equipment worked the land. The family house had been repaired from top to bottom. Yet the most important thing had not changed. The farm still belonged to the Turner family. Across the state, hundreds of other family farms had also survived. After uncovering the truth behind the acquisition scheme, Alex transformed his company's approach completely. Instead of purchasing struggling farmland, the company created programs that helped owners remain independent. What began as a solution for one farm became an opportunity for entire communities. On a bright Saturday afternoon, Willow Creek gathered for its annual spring festival. Main Street was decorated with banners, flower displays, and local vendors. Children laughed as they ran between booths while musicians played on a small outdoor stage. The entire town seemed determined to celebrate a year filled with second chances. Maggie stood near the center of the square speaking with friends when she noticed a familiar pickup truck turning onto Main Street. Even after everything that had happened, seeing Alex still made her smile. He stepped out wearing jeans, boots, and a simple button-down shirt. No cameras followed him. No reporters waited nearby. The billionaire who once lived behind glass towers now seemed completely at home in a small Montana town. As the afternoon continued, the mayor stepped onto the stage to recognize several people who had helped preserve local farms throughout the region. When Alex's name was announced, the crowd applauded warmly. He thanked them briefly, then surprised everyone by walking away from the stage and heading directly toward Maggie. A quiet anticipation spread through the crowd. Alex stopped in front of her and reached into his jacket pocket. In his hand was the silver locket that had remained with him from the day she found him in the wheat field. Maggie immediately recognized it. Alex opened the locket and held it where she could see inside. The engraved message remained exactly as it had always been. Come back to where you became human. But now there was something else. Beside the words sat a small photograph of Turner Farm at sunset. The image captured the field's glowing gold beneath an endless sky. Maggie looked up at him, already feeling emotion rise in her chest. Alex smiled. For months I thought this message was telling me where I had been. He paused. Now I know it was telling me where I belonged. The crowd grew completely silent. Alex took a slow breath. I spent years chasing success. I built companies, signed contracts, and appeared on magazine covers. People called me powerful, but none of those things made me happy. His eyes never left hers. Then one storm changed everything. I lost my memory, but somehow I found myself. Maggie felt tears gathering. Alex continued softly. You saw a stranger lying in a field and chose kindness. You never cared who I was. You never cared what I owned. You simply helped someone who needed help. He smiled. And that changed my life forever. Then he lowered himself onto one knee in front of the entire town. A collective gasp moved through the crowd. Maggie Turner, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. You gave me a second chance at life, a reason to believe in people again, and a place that finally feels like home. Will you marry me? Tears slipped down Maggie's cheeks as she laughed through them. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, Only joy. Yes, she answered. Of course I will. The crowd erupted into applause. Church bells rang from across town. Friends cheered. Neighbors wiped away tears. Alex stood and slipped the ring onto her finger before wrapping her in a warm embrace. Above them, the Montana sky stretched endlessly blue. The same land that had once witnessed uncertainty now witnessed hope. The same fields that had hidden a stranger now surrounded a future neither of them had imagined possible. As the celebration continued around them, Alex glanced once more at the silver locket. The message inside had guided him farther than he ever realized. Sometimes the greatest fortune was not measured in dollars or companies. Sometimes it was found in a small farmhouse, a kind heart, and the courage of one woman who chose to help a stranger when nobody else could.